Dobroveče, želim da vam poželim dobrodošlicu na promociju knjige koju je izdao Crnogorski PEN Center, našeg uglednog gosta večeras. Promocija knjige Januša Bugajskog u organizaciji Fakulteta za crnogorski jezik i književnost i Crnogorskog PEN-a. Knjiga je izašla 2022. godine u izdanju Jamestown fondacije za koju gospodin Bugajski radi. Naslov na našem jeziku je Neuspjela država, vodič za krah Rusije ili ti fail state, a guide to Russia, Rupture. Ja ću sad zbog našeg gosta, ovu promociju ćemo voditi na engleskom jeziku, pa ću zbog našeg gosta preći na engleski jezik i tako ćemo započeti razgovor. Mr. Bugajski, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have you here on the Faculty for Montenegrin Language and Literature. This is one of the most important and most valuable institution for Montenegrin culture and education. So it's a special pleasure to have you here, and also the PEN Center, who is actually publisher of your book here in Montenegro. Thank you for your...
Thank you very much. Thank you. Should I come up here and say a few words, or are you going to continue, or should I?
I thought to have a small introduction of
okay,
you, although I think that everyone knows who you are, but it's
just in case.
Just in case. Okay, I prepared that, so I will read it. So, Mr. Bugajski is a political scientist, senior fellow of the Jamestown Foundation in Washington. He's the author of 22 books about...
24 now.
24, okay, sorry. About Europe, Russia, and transatlantic relation, and he's a columnist for several media, including the media around the region. He also has been a senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis and was the director of the new European Democracy Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. Also, he has served as a consultant for the U.S. Department of Defense and the U.S. Agency for International Development, known as USA, and was, of course, chair for Center Europe and Central East Europe Area Studies at the Foreign Service Institute in U.S. State Department. He has testified several times for different kind of congressional committees, including Helsinki Committee, Senate Foreign Relation, and other. He also served as a host in the last period of Bugajski Hour. It's a program for the Balkan. After this short introduction, you said that you would like to say a few words about your book, and then we will ask you questions, and also the audience will have a possibility to ask you a few questions.
Excellent. Should I stand up here or should I sit here? Doesn't matter.
You can
stay here.
Stay here because this is the mic.
That's the mic. Okay,
yes.
Great. Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much to the PEN Center and to the Language and Literature Faculty for making possible the publication of my book, and special thanks to Jelena Pralas for translating it into Montenegrin. Maybe we should also publish a Serbian version at some point. In any case, I'm going to make 4 or 5 very brief points about the book and then hand it back to Biljana, who's got a mountain of questions for me to answer. So
maybe even the audience, yes.
So let me begin by saying this. First of all, and I tell this to our officials, I believe that Western officials made a grave mistake when they assumed that the collapse of Soviet communism ensured the end of Russian imperialism. And we see the results today. They must now avoid a second strategic miscalculation that presumes that the current Russian empire is permanent. Imperial states invariably collapse when they overreach, particularly militarily, as Moscow has in Ukraine, and where, we can talk about this later, centrifugal pressures are increasing within Russia. The invasion of Ukraine has accelerated the decline of the Russian state and raised prospects for domestic turmoil. I actually wrote the book, the first version, the English version, just before the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, before the attack on Kyiv. So it was the end of January. They allowed me a couple of weeks to update, But to me, the invasion, that act in itself indicated that Russia was entering its final stage. It accelerated, I think, the process of internal rupture, which has been delayed by various factors, although I didn't set a specific timeline. But if you look now at what's happening within Russia, you have an unsustainable militarization of the economy. You have falling state revenues. They've used up a lot of their reserves. There's various estimates exactly. I mean, this has kept them going for the past couple of years. And the fact that they've turned the civilian economy into a war economy. But that's unsustainable. They have, as I said, shrinking financial reserves, falling revenues from oil. I mean, they lost the European market, and the Chinese, Indians, and others are buying Russian gas and oil at very low prices. They don't have any more investment from the West. They cannot modernize. Industry is becoming increasingly obsolescent. Increasing elite conflicts. We've seen this, for instance, with the Prigozhin rebellion. It's the surface. There's a lot more going on under the surface. This constant movement of officials, military officers, and so forth from place to place. Let's face it, under Stalin, they would have been eliminated. Under Putin, they get moved somewhere else. Although at some point they may get eliminated, as Prigozhin was, quite frankly. You also have military failure. I mean, if you have a look at the losses that Russia has sustained in Ukraine, latest estimate is over 720,000 dead or incapacitated troops. That figure also hides something else, which is a large part of the officer corps has been decimated by the Ukrainian forces. They've also lost, and they cannot do a full mobilization because Putin is very much afraid that this will create public unrest in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, and some of the larger cities. So what they do, they turn to Pyongyang for troops. Can you imagine? North Korean troops are now in Kursk Oblast, trying to reclaim Russian territory from a small Ukrainian force. I mean, you know, imagine this. Would you have imagined this 2 years ago? Because Ukraine does occupy a part of Russia. Okay, you also have signs of mounting regional and ethnic unrest. I'll come to this in a moment. Let me come to it now. This is my second main point. Moscow itself is very well aware of what lies in store and is trying to prevent it. And it's highlighting its fears by passing new repressive laws. Almost every day there's a new repressive law, and launching campaigns to combat separatism. Putin himself has said we cannot allow any decentralization because in some interview he did a couple of years ago, because we have over 200 potential conflicts in this country that could blow. So they're very much aware of what's going on. Let me give you a couple of things. In July this year, the Kremlin declared that 55 national liberation movements had formed an anti-Russian separatist movement to promote Russia's rupture. Okay, even if they're making it up, it shows you the fear that they have that this could happen, and is just under the surface. And most interesting for me, just last month, in November, Russia's Supreme Court declared the existence of a terrorist network, in quotes, consisting of 100, in quotes, 172 structural divisions organized on national and regional grounds, whose mission is to divide the Russian Federation into separate states. As it happens, I'm part of that network. It's called the Free Nations of Post-Russia Forum. And we do have, actually, I wrote to the Russian authorities and said, could you give me the names of all the 172 organizations? Because I can only count 40 that are cooperating with us at the moment. Maybe we can get the others aboard. But we've held meetings of activists and analysts, people from Russia, people from the regions, people from the republics. Many of them are in exile. Some of them operate more, let's say, clandestinely or secretly because of fears of what could happen to their families. But there's increasingly large diasporas of people like Buryats and Bashkirts, and not to mention the Ichkerians, the Chechen diaspora, which is huge anyway. But we work with these people and we help to organize forums for them in different capitals. We've had 2 major sessions in Washington, in Warsaw, London, Berlin, Tokyo, Rome, and in the European Parliament. with the help of certain Polish officials, parliamentarians. That's another part. I'm not going to go into it here. The whole neo-Prometheism movement, which I hope my next book is going to be about. One other thing about this book, maybe two other things. You'd be pleased to hear that this book was singled out for condemnation by Nikolai Patrushev, the former secretary of the Russian Security Council and former head of the FSB. In response, we published a Russian version of the book, which has been, interesting enough, distributed in Russia. But also, I have a Ukrainian version of the book, which my Ukrainian publishers said, when we went into Kursk, they took a lot of Russian prisoners, but we didn't know what to do with them. But we do want to educate them. So they asked my publishers for a few hundred copies of the Russian version of this book to distribute to the Russian POWs, to educate them about the future of Russia. So one other quick thing, this book, and as I'm boasting a little bit, let me just say it won the Warsaw University Award for the best foreign language book last year, and it was subsequently translated into Polish as well. I don't want to take up too much more time, but let me say, actually you're going to ask me the questions about this, because I'm convinced that the coming collapse of the Russian Federation will improve the security of several regions, both those neighboring Russia, but also a little bit further away in the Balkans. So as far as Russia's concerned, the Balkans do neighbor Russia. And we can go into this a little bit in questions. But the last point I want to make is that, unfortunately, and I do a little bit with them on these points, most Western officials still believe that we can return to the post-Cold War era, to that status quo that we had after the Cold War, which I believe is not possible. They do not visualize the benefits of Russia's disintegration. I mean, the true Russophobia is those that irrationally fear the collapse of Russia, not those that fear Russia. Instead of planning to capitalize on Russia's de-imperialization and managing any negative repercussions, which I think there could be, there's still this wishful thinking that, okay, we can go back to business as usual with a post-Putin Kremlin, or that a handful of Russian liberals will be able to democratize the empire. I think a much more effective approach would be, as we did in parts of the Cold War, particularly near the end of the Cold War, we both worked for Radio Free Europe, is to broadcast more within Russia and to tell the Russian people what it is that Washington, Brussels, and other Western democracies want. We'd like to see pluralism, we'd like to see democracy, we'd like to see real federalism, not this fake federalism that now exists. We'd like to see human rights, civil rights, and the autonomy of republics and regions if they cannot fit into the federal structure. And there was a free choice of 83 Russian regions and republics, whether to stay in some sort of rump Russia or to leave and form their own states. And I do think, this will be my last point, that democratizing Russia is wishful thinking, whereas the emergence of new states that can establish good relations with neighbors, they're not all necessarily going to be model democracies, but there's more chance of democratic development of smaller units that emerge from the Russian Federation than there is of democratizing this huge empire which sucks really resources from all these republics. So let me stop there.
Okay, these last 2 points that you made, I actually wanted to ask you to deepen a little bit further, but I will start with the first thing that actually comes to my mind reading this book. It's actually that you are talking about the third phase of collapse of Russian Empire. Mm-hmm. First one was the end of the Soviet influence, Iron Curtain, or East Bloc, as we know. Second one is the fall of the Soviet Union as such. And the third one is this long phase of Russian Federation. You were talking about all the reasons that actually are the key point that you believe that in the end we will most of the analytics regarding the Russia that you are actually quoting, and you said that very often you said that there are two things that are problematic regarding the analysis regarding the Russia, and not just from analytics, but also from policymakers. They're always counting on the Putin pragmatism, which is, as you argue, absolutely not in case. And the second one is that actually you believe that lots of them, we know, actually are counting on Russian military force. It turned out to be not exactly so strong as most of the world actually believe. But could the books for me, your book for me is actually the most interesting from the perspective that you are actually offering the West, or maybe precisely the United States, contingency plan, what to do, and some strategies how to develop to be prepared for that rupture. Could you please deepen a little bit about that? What we can expect? You said there is opportunity, but there is also the danger of it. Could you please further explain?
As you say, thank you very much. I devote the whole chapter to recommendations. That's what we do in Washington when we write a book. We always give recommendations to the government, incoming government in particular, when there's a changeover of administration. Doesn't necessarily mean they'll listen to it all, but if they read it, at least something will stay in their minds. I think I boil it down to two things with regards to what we can do vis-a-vis Russia. We're not going to affect developments inside the country to any great extent. In other words, we can give information. We can tell them about what policies we're likely to adopt once the state starts to break up. We can support democracy and so forth. But that will only have limited impact. What will happen within Russia will depend on the citizens of Russia. And I'm not calling them deliberately Russians, because a third of the population, more or less, are not actually Ruski, even though they live, we can say they're Rusyania, they live within the Russian Empire, but they're not necessarily Russians. So I think two things. One, the repercussions, potentially negative repercussions, if the center starts to hit out. In other words, if they try and create some sort of problems for neighboring states, for the Baltic states, for Poland, for Kazakhstan, for countries in the South Caucasus. In other words, we need to be prepared for a potential spillover of conflict that Moscow is generating. And this is why Poland in particular is building one of the biggest militaries in Europe and spending already over 4% of its GDP, twice of what Trump wants even, of its GDP on the military, and is building one of the biggest forces in Europe. It's actually going to be the biggest conventional force in Europe in the next 3 to 4 years. Why the Baltic states have increased their own military spending, rebuilding their territorial defense forces. Why Finland is preparing for a potential outright conflict with Russia having entered NATO. So preparation for any potential spillover, any potential provocations from Moscow.
What kind of preparation?
Military preparations. Poland is building this what they're calling the sort of the wall against Russia. In other words, along the Belarusian border and along the Krulevets, Kaliningrad Oblast. In other words, in preparation for any kind of conventional attack.
Do you believe that incoming US administration with Mr. Trump will actually wanted to strengthening the force of its allies to fight back?
Absolutely. Trump praised Poland. Trump was Poland's best friend throughout his presidency.
But he is not particularly fond of NATO, fond of interfering in other countries, even for the allies.
Yeah, I think that's exaggerated. I wouldn't take him at his word. He's unpredictable. He's contradictory. I think what he's wanted, which I think he was correct up to a point, is for all NATO countries to spend much more on defense. I wish he'd criticize Hungary on this question, because Hungary actually underperforms more than anybody else on defense and Central.
But Orban is his friend.
But Orban is his friend.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't take that at face value. I think the more NATO spends, in other words, the Allies spend, the more they create militaries, the more he will say, see, they are doing their bit. So we should help those that are helping themselves. His point was actually against countries such as Germany and other West European countries that were certainly not doing enough on defense. He was also very good on the energy question, where he criticized the Germans for buying cheap, making themselves dependent through Nord Stream and other sources on Russian gas to run their business. So, yeah, I mean, Trump, whatever one thinks of him in his personality, he also has a potentially very good national security team around him that he's beginning to build. Most of them, not everyone. Who, quite frankly, I think may be a lot tougher on Russia than the Biden administration. Unfortunately, and again, this goes back to the war, during this administration, we had no real strategy. What is it we wanted to accomplish vis-a-vis Ukraine? We'll stay with you forever, however long it takes. What does that mean? The point from the beginning should have been, we'll stay with you until you win this war and liberate your territories. That never came out of their lips. Neither Biden nor his national security advisor nor the Secretary of State. The provision of weapons, it was drip feed. The Ukrainians should have been provided all these weapons as the Poles were urging from the very beginning. You know, the Russian military, as you said, is not very strong when confronted by NATO weaponry and a determined force defending their territory. We saw this. But they still didn't receive enough weapons to continue the successes we saw in Kiev, Kherson, Kharkiv.
But do you think that Trump's personal animosity, let's say like that, toward Ukraine can play the role, and especially Trump's, let's say, quite fond relation in the first mandate, in the first administration with Putin, and admiration that he every now and often expressed toward Putin, can play the role in regulating that really, really important issue for...
Yeah, let me just say this. Trump doesn't admire any individual except himself, but he admires people that are strong. In other words, if Putin starts to lose, like we've now seen in Syria, and if other things begin to go south, as we say in America, for him, he's not going to support a loser. Trump supports winners. That's what he likes to be seen as. He doesn't support, but he says favorable things about dictators because he thinks they're strong. He thinks they're powerful. He thinks they control everything. Putin has appeared as such, and he's been fooled, I think, by a lot of Russophiliac academics and other policymakers, that Russia is an impregnable, invincible power. So he thinks Russia is strong. Nobody informed him, by the way, that Russia's lost wars. But now that he begins to see that Putin isn't as strong as he appears, that could change. Plus, I would say there are people around him in the administration now who are much more, I would say, Reaganite in their approaches to Russia.
I guess you mean on the Marco Rubio, who is supposed to be the Secretary of State.
National
He's
Security.
the classical Republican in a way.
National Security Advisor, the head of CIA, the new
Radcliffe, yes.
Plus the new majority leader in the Senate.
Yes.
Who's coming in?
Right.
You know, these are traditional
Republicans,
internationalist Republicans who understand Russia.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't be as pessimistic. I'm actually, I would say, cautiously optimistic about this Trump team, that they can achieve much more. And you could have a situation where, one scenario, where Trump desperately wants, as he said, he wants to end this war. So he's going to try to bring together Putin and Zelensky. Zelensky's very, very, very smart. He's already met Trump a couple of times. He was at Notre Dame then.
Yes, exactly.
And actually, Trump came up to him afterwards again to shake his hand. So I would be careful about this idea that Trump hates Ukraine. I don't think that's the case. He's, I think, a little bit confused about Ukraine, but I don't think he hates Ukraine. So if he says to Zelensky, okay, I want you to meet with Putin, he says to Putin, I want you to meet with Zelensky, I will personally mediate, or I have my people around to mediate. Zelensky's more likely to say, okay, let's go along with this. Let's see how far it can go. Smart. You think Putin's going to accept this? No way. And then what happens? He rejected my overtures here. And there are people actually already around Trump that are saying, if you look at some of these positional papers, if Moscow isn't willing to make some sort of a deal, then we're going to have to force them to come to the table. How? By really properly arming Ukraine, making sure they have every weapon they need to bring Russia to the table. So you may have a situation where Trump is going to be a lot tougher on Russia than Biden has been over the past 2.5 years.
That's really positive and optimistic.
Yeah, I'm
said
cautiously optimistic. That's what I say.
Yes.
Yeah.
Let's talk about a little bit about your prediction regarding the failing rupture of the Russian state. What will happen? First of all, how long do you think it will take to get in that phase?
Some people are saying that the unraveling.
And which kind of breakup will be violently or peaceful? Dissolution of the.
Right. Some people are saying that even the dissolution of the Soviet Union hasn't yet been completed. Because remember, you have still these autonomous regions in Moldova and Georgia.
I noticed that you mentioned the self-determination of the republic inside the Russian Federation.
Yeah.
So you believe that it will be a new state?
I think there will be.
After the Russian dissolution in this, as a Russian Federation in this form?
New states will definitely emerge from Russia. The question is, how long will it take? How many? What sort of governments, what sort of systems that will develop? And a large part of the book, one chapter, I talk about neighborhood relations, because new relations will be developed between emerging states and neighboring countries, many of which are, related through kinship, through religion, through ethnicity, through language. Look at North Caucasus, for instance, or Central Asia. Look at the whole Mongol world, Buryatia and Tuva and Kalmykia. I mean, these are Mongol Buddhist republics. That are going to gravitate more towards Mongolia, possibly some of others, Altai and so forth, towards Kazakhstan. So I do see a process of gravitation out of Russia. The big question, of course, is, as we saw here in Yugoslavia, when Yugoslavia broke up in the 1990s.
Maybe we should mention that you were the only analytic who actually predicted for the Pentagon at the time that Yugoslavia will
break up violently.
Yeah, maybe that's the.
Yeah, that was in 1990, actually, about a year before the war began. But you ask how it will break up. I think it will be a mix. It will be a mix of some of the Yugoslav scenarios. Remember, not all the Yugoslav breakups were that violent. I mean, Slovenia escaped relatively unscathed. Montenegro escaped relatively unscathed in terms of violence. Macedonia as well. Serbia escaped unscathed itself, even though they provoked the wars. I think the big question is going to be, how strong and determined will Moscow be to try and preserve the empire? Because it's not the countries that are leaving that start the violence. Often it's the empire trying to preserve the empire that starts the violence against the so-called separatists. And we saw this with Milosevic. Milosevic was trying to keep, first of all of Yugoslavia together. Then he was, Slovenes, you can go. But then he was trying to keep the rest of Yugoslavia together. So it's that violence that Moscow could generate. Now, if they reach for ethnic questions, if you notice, Putin has avoided Ruski nationalism. Occasionally it rears its ugly head vis-a-vis immigrants and guest workers from Central Asia or North Caucasus. Most of the time he's kept down these more radical Russian nationalists, because there's a division between the nationalists and the imperialists in Russia, in order to try and maintain the integrity of this multinational state, which has about 180, 200 different ethnic groups. But if he reaches for Ruski nationalism to try and keep the country together, to appeal to Mother Russia, to the Orthodox Russia, then he's going to have even bigger problems, because the resistance then amongst some of the Muslim people, the Buddhists as well, and even some of the Russian regions that are resisting and will resist, I think, increasingly exploitation by Moscow. There's a colleague of mine, by the way, at Jamestown, Paul Goebel, who's been following Russia's internal developments probably for about 40, 50 years. He used to work for Reagan in the White House. But he believes that Russia's rupture will actually, more, in addition to the North Caucasus, is more likely to begin in Siberia, in some of the regions that have the resources that Moscow exploits, that it basically robs, the metropolis robs the colonies, in fact, of its resources and gives back some of it, very, very small amounts. I mean, the poverty in these regions that have enormous gas and oil resources is astonishing.
And it's also basically completely destroyed civil society in Russia. Mm-hmm. You were talking in the beginning of your connection with that small liberal group. Most of them are actually outside of country, mm-hmm. and you were arguing somewhere. I cannot remember correctly where it was, but you were arguing something that the Russian opposition, a liberal, democratically oriented Russian opposition, should form some kind of government in exile.
Yeah.
Do you believe that they can be, because at least for now they look pretty weak,
yeah.
and actually the nationalists once again can play the main role, and the deep states, reminds of the FCJK and in that.
Good questions. There's several points here.
Yes.
The group I work with, I wouldn't define as liberal. They are ethno-nationalists and regionalists. In other words, we have people from Siberia, from Novosibirsk, from Tomsk, who are trying to establish these resistance movements. We have people from Ingria as well. I mean, these aren't ethnic republics, but potentially quite rich European state, Ingria, the area around St. Petersburg and so forth. We have also, of course, the Chechens. The Chechens have a government in exile. The Chechnya Ichkeria has a government in exile. They have troops in Ukraine. There's several thousand Chechen troops fighting in their own battalions within the Ukrainian armed forces. There's also a Tatarstan government in exile that we work with, as well as representatives and people from Buryatia, from other parts of the Far East, from North Caucasus. I mean, the Circassian question, which I think is going to gain increasing traction. Circassians have a huge diaspora in nearby Turkey, so like 6 million people of Circassian descent, and other parts of the Middle East. So all these, the Russians are preventing them coming home. So all these Republican and regionalist movements, I wouldn't call them Russian liberal opposition. In fact, the Russian liberal opposition, if you're talking about Khodorkovsky and Kasparov has moved. Yes. Kasparov has moved more towards us. But
Vladimir Kara-Murza is now out of state as well. He's
made some mixed statements. Yes. Navalny, of course, who is I would call her a liberal imperialist, like Navalny,
exactly.
Wants to keep Russia together. They have even refused to have any contacts with groups such as ours.
And I guess we have to count on the internal fighting inside the Putin circle that probably existed even right now.
Absolutely. But let me tell you one other group, because you mentioned about the future of Russian opposition. There is one other group called the Congress of People's Deputies, chaired by Ilya Ponomarev, who is actually one of the few formally elected members from Russia. And they have about 20 or 30 people. In total, something like 8 million people voted for them in previous elections in Russia. They're now in exile. But they formed this Congress of People's Deputies, and they support the volunteer Russian Legion in the Ukrainian armed forces that have participated in some of the operations in Belgorod, in Kursk, and a couple of other oblasts. So there is a potential, and they want to establish a Russian republic, and they're open to the idea very much that once we do, every ethnic group, every republic will have a right to leave the country if that is the will of the people. So in other words, it's not the Russian liberal position.
Logical question would be how many states you are expecting to be there?
Anywhere from a dozen to over 40 are the estimates. It depends. It may be a snowball effect. Once one republic leaves, and they leave relatively peacefully, for instance, or with minimal violence, and they establish relations with neighbors, start to register some success, that's going to have a positive effect on other neighbors. Mountain Republic, for instance, in the North Caucasus existed after the Tsarist Empire collapsed, which was the first collapse of the Russian Empire, and it consisted of 6 different nationalities that formed one the mountain republic of the North Caucasus. There's talk now of establishing some sort of confederation of about 6 or 7 republics, which have Russian populations that have been dropping completely. There are very few Russians left in the region.
Before we pass up till now, we were talking about internal things, but we will pass a little bit on the impact all around the region. And I wanted to ask you on something that many analysts and policymakers, political scientists always mentioning when it comes to Russia is nuclear threat. You have also a little bit different opinion regarding that. You don't see that as much as a danger as other people see, although we have to mention that Russia has around 6,000 nuclear warhead and also a significant number of biological and chemical weapons. So could you explain why you are dismissing that as a serious implication in the case of a Russian collapse?
Yeah, a couple of things. Putin and company are not nuclear jihadists. In other words, they're not going to commit nuclear suicide by attacking, what are they going to do? Attack the West with nuclear weapons when the country starts to crumble? It doesn't make sense. Will they use nuclear weapons internally? You know, these theater nuclear short range, or in the case of Russia, because it's big, the mid-range nuclear weapons against some territory. Why would they do that? This would spark a even worse, let's say, outcry against Moscow, both internally, but also internationally. Internationally, there are indications that China has been leaning very heavily on Moscow to even stop talking about this threat. Because, you know, they keep talking every so often. Medvedev, by the way, it's a very good joke about, you mentioned Zelensky earlier. What's the difference between Zelensky and Medvedev? Zelensky is a former comic who became a president. Medvedev is a former president who became a comic. So, and he's threatening nuclear war every so often against them. But even some of these what we consider reasonable, pragmatic intellectuals, Karaganov and others have been talking about let's fire a nuclear weapon on Poland to teach them a lesson. That will stop NATO in its tracks. I don't see that. They're going to try and maintain as much as possible of the inner empire. They're going to cling, like we saw the collapse of the Soviet Union.
You don't see the threat that some role player can reach the nuclear weapon.
Who?
The states in the case of the chaos.
Yeah, but the states that emerge aren't going to want to destroy their neighbors. They're going to want international recognition. It's going to be a little bit like Ukraine and Kazakhstan with the collapse of the Soviet Union. They'll say, let's negotiate, we'll give up whatever stockpiles we have, not just nuclear, but other weapons of mass destruction, in order to get international recognition and maybe some security guarantees. That's much more likely than them firing a nuclear weapon at who?
Okay.
And that's even aside from the technical process of deploying, firing a nuclear weapon. And we don't quite know what state it's in anyway in Russia. They've been boasting about how powerful they are conventionally. They've been lying about the weapons they've developed. We don't know what condition their nuclear weapons are in anyway. Would they be able to fire them?
Okay, now we will talk a little bit about the impact. As we wait to Russian Federation to collapse, we have a significant influence of Russia all around the region, around the neighbors, Middle East, around the Western Balkans. And maybe we should mention the current crisis regarding the Georgia, regarding the Moldova, regarding the Romania, who is a European member state. As we are waiting for Russia, for Putin's Russia to collapse, we can absolutely agree that there are all those significant problems inside of Russian society, especially accelerated after the Ukrainian invasion, after the invasion of Ukraine. But we also know that Russia, for the not just period of time, even the last decade, and maybe even more seriously and very successfully undermining the societies all around the world. How can a state like Russia, with so many problems, with so many weaknesses, be so successful in undermining the society all around the world?
Well, it's a long tradition. They did it during communist times. If you remember...
But this time they are very successful, especially in the West, which is the main problem, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, look, they've built on the methodology they developed during Soviet times in terms of influencing labor unions, communist movements, youth groups, peace protests, etc., etc. They've developed that in a modern context, which, now means internet, now means social media. You can reach far more people far more quickly and disinform them.
They mastered that, actually.
They have.
Yes.
They've mastered that. Also, I would say it's not just political. It's not just that. It's political corruption. It's much cheaper to buy off politicians, as we've seen in Hungary, as we've seen in Serbia, as we've seen in Bosnia, other places, than it is to send in your force. It doesn't make. It's much cheaper to actually do it from within, to create that problem from within. Also, I would say sabotage operations. One thing that you didn't talk about, what the Russians have been up to in the past few months, is, and there's a little bit has been written about it, but we haven't really responded strongly, cutting cables of underwater internet, destroying some military facilities. There's a whole range of sabotage operations that Russian agents are now engaged in to try and undermine NATO. And some are saying that what could happen, could be a test. They're not going to invade a NATO country conventionally because they know they're going to lose and they're not sure of the response. It could be a major response from the West. But if they do it through some sort of, I don't like the word hybrid, but some sort of non-recognizable force, some sort of mercenaries that march in and overthrow a government or start a firefight in parliament or, whatever it is that undermines, it shows that Russia can intervene in a NATO country without a major response. I don't think we're prepared for all those under the threshold sabotage and subversion operations and even potential government overthrow operations in parts of the NATO structure.
Would you agree that they are successful because of the social media development, because they actually master, you agree with that, with misinformation and disinformation?
Yeah.
And do the West has any kind of leverage or any kind of measures or any kind of tools to push back against that?
Yeah, well, I don't think we've pushed back enough. Yeah. Actually, in the book I talk about, we should be much more active in sending not disinformation but information to the Russian public about what their own leaders are doing to them. But the other side of it, unfortunately, in the West, we do have a very gullible public. And people that get their political information from watching TikTok or, a headline.
You saw what happened in Romania?
Exactly. That's why I mentioned TikTok.
EU, yes.
That's why I mentioned TikTok. So in other words, we have a very poorly politically educated public in much of the West, including in America. But even in Central East European countries that have been through dictatorships, that even in Romania, for instance, which has never been a friend of Russia in history, there's always been some conflict vis-a-vis Russian Empire or even during communist times. And yet they're gullible enough to vote for a leader that's been promoted by Russia. So we're not informing our own public enough, we're not educating them enough about what to be aware of, what to be wary of. I don't think there should be control over that. I don't like calling it media, social networks, I would say. But there has to be, I think, more alternative content, meaning true content, where people can turn, not in complex analyses of what's going on, but much more simple terms. Where you're being manipulated. What are the facts here? Much more of this needs to be done, I think.
There is a completely difference in the way regarding the Russian neighborhood, Baltic states, how they actually push back toward the Russian propaganda, although they are daily exposed to it, and the way how the still not EU members, but EU aspirant like Georgia, like Moldova, especially right now, I would say it's very interesting, the case significantly case of Georgia.
Yeah.
I would say, because I can draw some parallel with Montenegro as well, because we also have the government that actually saying it's for EU integration. 80% of our population is for EU integration. It was like that in Georgia. But I would say we have a problem because we have minus civil activity like we saw in Georgia those days. What do you think that will happen there?
Well, Georgia has two advantages. We talked about this earlier.
Yes.
They have very strong civil society, which is very, not just pro-EU, it's also very pro-NATO and pro-American. Secondly, they still have a very legitimate and very popular and very brave president, Zurabashvili, who is resisting this illegitimate election. And it's going to be interesting what will happen in the next few weeks, because it looks as though she's not going to recognize this indirect election in parliament of a new president. And of course, parts of Georgian territory are occupied, continue to be occupied by Russia.
And despite that, Russia is very strong there with their campaign of influence.
Well, there's a couple of things. They've injected through one particular oligarch, of course, but not just him. They've injected a lot of money into the political structure. They've bought off a lot of politicians. They've promised them all sorts of perks. The election campaign itself is helped to be financed by all the things we've talked about in other countries. So, and of course, one very important factor is how they've used the Georgian church, Georgian Orthodox Church as well, for the purposes of depicting some of these politicians in the West as being corrupt, as being degenerate, and whereas Russia is a more traditional, which is absolutely ludicrous if you look at Russia, a more traditional Christian society. Yeah. So all these factors, I think, play into it, and I can't predict to you exactly what will happen in Georgia, but I do see the beginnings of a revolution. In other words, it could be another Maidan, like in Kiev, where the Ukrainians said, no, we're not going, we're staying here, even if you kill us. The heavenly 100, the 100 that they killed, over 100 actually on the streets of the Maidan. Something similar I would expect to happen in Georgia, that some of these young people who are absolutely fed up are going to start to get armed or start to defend themselves.
Do you believe that they would dare to do it in Georgia, to deepen the military intervention there as well? Having in mind that they're already stuck in the...
Oh, the Russians? No, I don't... I cannot see, if the Russians were to enter into Georgia, I think that would turn large parts of the Georgian army against them. Because they cannot, a lot of the Georgian army has cooperated very closely with NATO. Some of these officers have been trained in the West, including in American academies. For them to tolerate another Russian invasion on territory closer even to Tbilisi, outside of Ossetia and Abkhazia, I do not see that. And that's the big danger for this regime, if the military turns against them. Not so much the police forces, but if the military turns against them and maybe even stages a coup against this illegitimate government. Ironically, a democratic coup. Well, we've had this in Turkey, I suppose.
You're predicting that?
It's one of the things I would say one has to bear in mind as a strong possibility.
Before we pass to Balkan, I want to mention one currently very hot topic, and it's also implicating Russia. It's a sudden, or maybe not so suddenly, chain of events in Syria, and the impact of Russian aspiration there. Russia has two major military bases or facilities there, port town Latakia and Zveler Tartus. Despite they gave the asile to Assad and his family, they also immediately removed the old flag, they put the new flag, they start to communicate with new rebel leaders. The US also has around 900 troops there, and they are, for now, Biden administration said that they are considering to send it more, but not, they are pretty much watching how the situation is unfolding. And so a part of uncertainty regarding the emerging new leader, Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, military leader, with a quite a military, extreme military background from Al Qaeda and ISIS, although he's now trying to present himself as a moderate leader and sending the message, I would say, primarily to the West. How do you see the situation? There are a lot of sides that are interesting in situation in Syria. It's a Turkey who, as we speak, they're fighting the Kurds, Kurd rebellions there. There is a Russia, there is a Iran, and there is a US. Current administration is very careful. They are not sure how to, at least that's how they present it, so they are not sure how to deal. They are trying to following situation. But the incoming administration, Mr. Trump administration, he said immediately, that's not our fight, we don't have an interest there. So do you think that, I guess that we can say that this situation in Syria at this point is weakening the Russians. But do you think that they will try to explore in their own advantage this? And how?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely exposed Russia as an unreliable ally. I mean, they've been defending Assad for over 10 years, since the beginning of the Syrian civil wars. 2011. And yet, it's not Kiev that fell in 3 days, it's Damascus that fell in 3 days. So, Russia has failed in supporting its ally. And that sends a strong signal, I think, to other allies who think that Russia is, once we get the Russians on our side, we're invincible. So that's one. Secondly, the Russians themselves will try to plan ahead. Remember what they did with the Taliban in Afghanistan. They became great friends with them. So they're going to try and ingratiate themselves in one way or another with this new regime, whatever it will be in Syria. I think it's too early to say exactly how this new government will develop, who will include, how tolerant it will be to other religions, to minorities, etc.
What do you think that their primary goal will be? Make amendments with the West or with Russia?
I think,
having in mind the interest of long and short.
Well, first of all, they're going to be close to Turkey, and Turkey is a NATO member. Remember, we shouldn't forget that. I personally think we haven't done enough to establish good relations or to restore relations with Erdogan, and Turkey is absolutely key in this region. And actually, going back to my book, it's going to be one of the key countries when Russia starts to collapse.
Exactly.
Because it's not only is it nearby, but it has a lot of diasporas from Russia on its territory. But going back to Syria, I think, if I was to advise this new regime, I'd say, if you turn to Russia, you're going to fall like Assad in a few years' time. You need to reach out to as many factions as possible. Obviously not ISIS. And the new leader, remember, he was part of a faction of Al Qaeda, but has distanced himself from them in recent years. So we'll see. I think it's too early to tell exactly how this regime will pan out. But my advice to them would be reach out more to Turkey, reach out more to the West. There's another interesting factor in all this, which you didn't mention, another country closely involved, which is Israel.
Yes, exactly.
Because,
they entered in the buffer zone in Golan, and they have an interest because
Israel is destroying as much as possible of the military facility, because that's a lifeline to Hezbollah and to Hamas from Iran.
Exactly.
So, behind all this, there's also this Israeli-Iranian conflict. Trump, he can say what he likes, that we don't have a fight in this, but you will. If Israel becomes more involved, another thing that should be mentioned, if some of the other Arab states, Saudi Arabia, if they become more involved in this conflict, then I think it's inevitable. And if Iran starts to disrupt shuts the Straits of Hormuz and starts to do,
But Saudi Arabia positioned itself in the last period almost for 10 years, even from the first Trump administration, as someone who wants to cooperate and who actually very well cooperated
very good relations with
and also using that opportunity to reach Abraham Accords with Israel.
Trump had very good relations with Saudi Arabia, with Qatar, with the Gulf states, and so forth. So that there is obviously there's an American fleet there. There's still energy interests. There's Israel. There's so many factors. Turkey's a member of NATO, remember, as well. So, there's so many factors involved here that America can't wash its hands of the Middle East.
Okay, we are passing now on the our probably for us most interesting part. It's when it comes to Western Balkans. During the weekend, I was in Sarajevo with a lot of people that are actually sitting here. We were gathering with the members of civil society in Bosnia and Herzegovina. At the same time, on the different occasion, was as well the Kosovo Prime Minister Albin Kurti.
Yeah.
But we all discuss about what are the main source of problem and new undermining the stability in the Western Balkans. And we all agreed on different stage and different platform that the main source is the Serbian government around, with Aleksandar Vučić regime. And they're actually trying to establish in this part of region, specifically in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, and the Kosovo, so-called Srpski svet, Serbian world. It's a new name for already once defeated Great Serbia, but it's also a nickname that actually corresponds with Russian Mir, and Russia is their major backer in that. And as we wait for Russian Federation putting Russia to collapse, what you can see that what's going on right now in the region, for example, I can say for myself, and I believe that others will agree, but here can say that actually our main problem is up till now, Serbia is very successful, although they have a lot of also domestic problem. They are very successful in undermining the other country in the region, and they have a support of Russia. Maybe Russia has its own problem now, it's not so involved, but previously they put very solid foundation, so the Serbia is actually undermining this region by itself pretty much with the small support of Russia. How do you see that situation will develop in the near future? You said for yourself once that you are actually futurist. Not you call yourself.
Well, actually, my Ukrainian friends call me futurist, but my Ukrainian publisher. But I mean, I agree with everything you've said. That there is a mini imperial project that Vučić, that Belgrade is now following, based on a couple of things. The sort of the weakness of the state around them compared to Serbia, militarily and diplomatically and so forth. The lack of attention by the West, sort of American, with partial, sometimes even full withdrawal from the region. Appeasement, in other words, that Europe and in Washington is not going to confront Belgrade. It thinks it can, give a few carrots, and they're going to follow these carrots and become good Europeans and good Democrats. And of course,
European Union as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why I said Brussels.
Yes.
Yeah. When I say Brussels, I mean European Union.
Yes.
And of course, Russia is exploiting this situation, encouraging this situation, facilitating this situation through supporting Vučić, supporting the program, supporting Banja Luka, of course, supporting all the pro-Serbian forces, as we see in Montenegro, activities of the Russian Orthodox Church with the Serbian Church. How far can Russia go?
Russia and Serbia here in the Western Balkans.
Well, let's put it this way. I don't think Russia's going to be able to send troops here. They're preoccupied elsewhere. But I think the message from Syria should be, and I hope Serbs are looking at this and saying, when it comes to the crunch, we can't rely on the Ruski. We can't rely on the Russians to help us. Which is, I think, a very important message for all allies of Putin at this time. But let's put it this way: if we begin to see the process of Russia rupturing in the next maybe year, 2 years, then I think it's going to be less able to provide the sort of support that it has been to Serbia, to its other proxies or allies in the region, including people like Orban, including Fico, including some of the Bulgarian politicians and so forth. In other words, if it's so preoccupied with trying to keep the country together, it may translate some provocations in vis-a-vis neighboring NATO states, but a lot of those resources and people are going to be diverted to try and keep Russia together, not try and help allies. What's happened with Syria? They try to get out as quickly as possible. A lot of those guys are going now to the Ukrainian front. So again, if you extrapolate from that to disinformation, media, corruption, they're not going to have as many resources to affect things in the Western Balkans.
And how do you see Serbia without Russian support in a year or two, as you mentioned?
Yeah.
Do you believe that it's possible to turn that country completely toward the West? And even there is a new non-paper, probably you saw that said that they see Serbia inside of NATO. Is it possible?
Well, there are those in the West who'd like to see. Quite frankly, I would like to see a normal democratic Serbia in NATO. I'd like to see the whole region in NATO. That's not the problem.
Feasible? Is it possible?
In the longer term, it probably is. Let's put it this way: Vučić is going to be weakened when Russia starts to collapse. It doesn't mean that the Serbian regime is going to fall overnight, but I think it will generate some conflicts internally in Serbia. Between the more, let's say, centrist or pro-democratic elements and the more nationalist elements that have depended more on Russia. Russia is strong, Russia's waking up, well, not so much anymore. So that's going to create some internal conflicts, I would say, in Serbia itself. But it's also very important for all of Serbia's neighbors, including Montenegro, to capitalize on this opportunity of Russia's collapse. In other words, some sort of common front in support of Russia's collapse, reaching out to the new republics that emerge, which I know Poland and the Baltic states and Ukraine are going to do, and probably Kazakhstan will as well, and maybe even Azerbaijan, and Georgia, and Mongolia. So some of the countries here, I think that, remember, you emerged from an empire, a mini empire, to support the new entities that are beginning to emerge from Russia. I think that's going to be key. As a first sort of, if not outright recognition, at least to talk about it, at least to give them some sort of platform, which is what Warsaw, Tallinn and Vilnius and Kyiv are doing right now.
So, as I understood you correctly, you are predicting some kind of internal conflict in Serbia at the moment when Russia is not so influential.
Yeah, I would say at the moment.
Well. I guess Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, and Kosovo will have some kind of real, they will be free of undermining their territory from the neighbor. But you mentioned that you are expecting some kind of internal conflict. We are seeing right now really serious shaking in the Serbian society.
Yes.
Well,
Look.
Yes.
I have maybe a little bit more faith in Serbian society and Russian society than maybe people in Montenegro. It's the leadership, it's certain political elements, it's the church, it's these nationalistic influences. I think most people want to be a part of Europe. They want to have a normal life, and they don't see, if Russia starts to collapse, what message is that going to send, not just militarily, but also economically and socially? That Russia's failed, that its economic model is a failure. We cannot rely on Russian investments. There's going to be less oligarchic corruption in Europe as a result of that. So all these factors are going to feed into, I think, potential for greater unrest against regimes that supported Russia and have been helped to be propped up by Russia.
Before I open the floor for the question from our audience, I would like to ask you one more question. I saw that you are actually cautiously optimistic regarding the Trump administration, but I would like to ask you, because this book is all 2 years, you said that you rewrite a little bit after the Russian invasion, but would you now, from this perspective, have any kind of different suggestions for that contingency plan after the Russian collapse for US and Western administration, and what would be?
Yeah, I would sharpen even more some of the recommendations I made. Make sure NATO is even better armed than I was saying before. Make sure that you're prepared to offer more support to new entities that are emerging from Russia. Don't be afraid of Russia. Russia has exposed itself as being not very competent militarily. Remember this, not just in Ukraine, but even internal rebellions. Remember the Prigozhin rebellion, this mutiny,
Yes.
which I think is an indication of the brittle nature of Russian security forces. So look more internally at what is happening in Russia, report more about it, make as many contacts as possible with such groups as I mentioned that I work with, to help basically those that want to either federalize Russia into a real federation, or if not, then split it up into new states that can become democracies and partners for the West.
Is there any kind of fear that I would say that the collapse of Soviet Union produced in a way Putin, and the people were hoping that he will restore the Russian power before. Is there any danger that we can see the same scenario in that part that you are predicting that will stay like Russia state?
Yeah, I mean, look, Putin relied on this sort of partially anyway, on this nostalgia. It was a sort of eclectic nostalgia for the Russian Empire, for communism, for Tsarism,
yes.
for the church, for, you know, it was a mix.
Bigger, strong.
Everything,
yes,
Stalin, who
yes.
murdered more Russians than any other leader, but nevertheless, he made a strong Russia. Yeah, I mean, Putin relies on this Russian idea of greatness through territorial conquest, and this sort of this superb or super civilization. But I think a lot of Russian people are realizing, and increasingly will realize, that this is a myth. This doesn't exist, and we cannot. The way we can live normally is not to rebuild an empire, but to create our own state. And this is why I think the Russian Republicans, those that I mentioned before, who want to build a Russian republic, not a Russian empire, but a Russian republic, I think, and I hope the future is with them.
Just one small additional question. We have here the Bishop of Montenegrin Orthodox Church, Vladika Boris, and I wanted to ask you regarding the Russian Orthodox Church and their influence on Russian society and the process that are going there. And we have here the same with the Serbian Orthodox Church and their influence. And, they are basically the tools of the Kremlin.
Exactly. The Russian Orthodox Church, it's a misnomer.
Switch on new.
It's I would say it's not really Russian in the sense of encompassing everybody in Russia. Orthodox, it's not really Christian. If you look at the things they say, that we should welcome death. We should welcome firing nuclear weapons because you know better than I do the sort of things the patriarch says. So I don't consider that actually as a Christian church. It's a cult that's promulgated by the state. It has influence. Probably, I don't even know how much influence.
Do you believe in possibility of reform, that kind of fundamentalism that they are actually spreading all around?
The best way to deal with the Russian Orthodox Church is to split from it, as the Ukrainians have done, as Russian Orthodox churches are now looking to do in Estonia, in Belarus, even neighboring countries. In other words, to split from the Moscow Patriarchy and create your own Orthodox Church. Just like the best way for Montenegrins to preserve and maintain their independence is split from the Serbian Orthodox Church and to help the Montenegrin Orthodox Church. And church can be very important in terms of national identity. Unfortunately, in Russia, the Orthodox Church is an imperial identity. It's not a national identity.
So now we will open the floor for the question.
Okay. How do you see the influence and on the case of the Montenegro Orthodox Church and Serbian Church in Montenegro, and supporting from the west side countries to the Serbian Church in the case of Lithuania from their embassy? And we have by the way, I will explain you. Orthodox Church is government church in every Orthodox country. So why the West countries didn't support our church, that is very old church, much more older than Serbian Orthodox Church, and we lose any support from the West side countries. How you can explain it?
Well, explain it through inertia. In other words, not paying sufficient attention, not understanding the history, the identity, the aspirations of a nation that's regained its independence. And it's not just with Montenegro. We saw similar in Macedonia. We saw similar. We'll probably see similar in Belarus as well in the future. In other words, a lot of politicians try to maintain what there is and think they can reform it into something better. That's what we see with Vučić.
Yes.
And a similar position vis-a-vis the Serbian Orthodox Church. So the other part of it, I would say, is the Montenegrin Orthodox Church really needs to promote itself much more internationally, to be better known internationally, to be better known in the diaspora, to be better known in international religious organizations, as well as other Orthodox churches, to gain recognition, to gain acknowledgement. So, it takes two to create momentum. The West certainly can change its policies and needs to, but that impetus also needs to come from internally, from Montenegro itself.
Any other question from the audience?
You have a question? I'm sure you have a question.
Yes, then maybe I can continue. We have, I would say, 15 minutes more. I think that you are very interesting as a interlocutor. So regarding the playing with the West, you were very critical regarding the support for stabilocracy, including the Vučić all around the Balkans. And although we can see some moves from the European Union, United States as well, toward this region, but we have a feeling that they still don't understand who are really Western orientated forces and who are on the other side. Specifically, we have, I would say that Montenegro at this moment have at least part of the government, maybe even more than a part of the government, who are actually, we can say for them, safely say for them on the base what we saw here in the last 4 years, that they have only pro-European rhetoric, but they don't do enough toward the pro-EU integration. They are actually on the domestic plan working studiously on completely crushing the substance of Montenegrin secular, Western-orientated and Western-based society. How we can deal, especially in small society like in Montenegro, with those things.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and we see a similar process in Georgia.
Exactly.
Where on the surface, even though most public support both NATO membership and EU membership, remember at least Montenegro is already in NATO, which is extremely important. Georgia isn't, but it was close, it was on the cusp, it was like Ukraine, it was about to be, if not invited, at least get a map process. But so it's almost like a sort of slow state capture. And as you said, the rhetoric remains the same, but the policies are different. Completely. And it's undermining the very objective that you're trying to achieve. The problem with the European Union, of course, is that it suits the European Union, in a way, you could say. Do they really want the rest of the Western Balkans in the European Union? Some of the governments in the EU don't.
they are promoting Western values rhetorically, but for example, in the case of Bosnia and Herzegovina, they are forcing
Precisely.
them to do the things that they would never accept in the
They're
Western
consolidating
countries.
the ethnic divisions, basically.
And they are going in that way toward the nationalist and ethnic divide. They are going toward the authoritarian leader like Dodik, like Čović, like
So it meshes. So you could say both the EU and some of the governments here have this facade of cooperation, collaboration, integration, whereas underneath both are trying to prevent that.
They don't see good enough, or they are trying to overcome a little bit the differences inside of our society. What do you think?
No, I think it's. I think that there's a lack of vision within the European Union. There's a lack of leadership.
But they have a clear picture of what's going on around.
I don't know how clear that picture is. I still think they live in some sort of illusions that this is no longer the 90s. That because the war is over, then these politicians either can be persuaded to conduct the reforms, or there'll be new elections and new forces will come in that will conduct the reforms, so we can get down to business to integrate you. I think that is more of the calculation, as we say, as you mentioned, stabilocracy. But unfortunately, it's not a policy that brings results. This process of closing chapters, opening and closing chapters, it's like opening and closing doors, could go on indefinitely. And you could have a new government in the meantime, which is even more against European Union entry.
Do you believe that existing possibility that in this region there are some analysis from the foreign analysts who are watching closely this region, that it's possible new conflicts here? Do you believe in that?
It's possible. It's possible. I a couple of years ago said if anywhere it could happen would be in Kosovo, which we've already seen some violence. And because there's a NATO presence and an American presence, Vučić is a little bit careful not to go too far. He's trying to provoke as much as he can. Bosnia, I think, is another potential equal or even bigger danger, I would say.
Having in mind the Vučić connection with Trump administration, you saw that Vučić and Dodik were celebrating and the parliament speaker of Montenegrin parliament, Mr. Mandić, they have high expectation from Vučić, from the Trump administration. Do you see a possibility that they will push now hard toward Kosovo and Prime Minister Kurti regarding establishing the association of Serbia?
Quite possibly. I think a lot of it depends on who they appoint as envoy. I don't think Trump personally is going to be involved in Kosovo. There's no sort of connection there, or in the Balkans, other than business, but that's his family members.
Stay out the pictures regarding the big post, because he was figuring in one point as a possible Secretary of State, then a head of CIA, an Ukrainian as an envoy for Ukraine, but now but in the meantime, he actually established very good relationship with the Serbian president, with the with the Albanian Prime Minister Edi Rama, and some business relations with the family of Jared Kushner, the son-in-law.
Some would say he's a lobbyist in a way for Serbia. But
how that connection can influence the politics in this region?
If you were to be appointed as special envoy with full powers to push for some sort of a new agreement, and I've written about this before, what I fear is the new partition of the region, a new attempted partition of the region. Because I think under the Trump administration, the first one, there was this sense that the only solution is to have 3 strong centers and have the other smaller countries revolve around them. In other words, Serbia, Croatia, and Albania. And that could possibly entail the carving up of Kosovo. Part of it would go to Serbia, part of it would go to Albania. And then you have the question of Montenegro, which fall under Serbian influence.
Do you think that the European Union would allow that?
Well, I don't think they would necessarily. Well, again, depends what you mean by allow. I can't see what they would do
I mean
to stop it if America pushes for it.
Standing by side and watching I mean, this is the area that actually they want to integrate in the European Union.
But they say they want to integrate it. The question also is the leadership of the European Union. Who is now the leader of the European Union? Germany?
For example, I have
France?
great hope in Kaja Kallas, foreign policy.
Look, if the Baltics ran the European Union, you'd already be in it. Let's put it that way. But you know, they're small countries. There's limited influence that they have, unfortunately. And you know, going back to your question, if our administration really starts to push on this, they're going to try and persuade members of the European Union. Already Hungary would be aboard, I think Slovakia would be aboard, possibly Romania, which has never recognized Kosovo, could be aboard. So, you know, I don't want to extrapolate too much from it, but if our administration is committed to that, which I don't see yet, although I saw indications of that during the first administration.
Exactly. Okay, we are actually running out of time for this interview. I want to thank you more than anyone else because you are having time to be with us here tonight and to discuss this important topic regarding this region, but globally as well, Russian influence that's spreading all around all the area that we were discussing last night. We are hoping to see you more often here.
Yeah.
Maybe your new books.
I have a new book, actually. I didn't even mention it, on
Yes,
Poland.
please do.
It's called Pivotal Poland, Europe's Rising Power. And I've been doing this research over the past 2 years, traveling a lot to Poland, meeting with everybody, during even the change of government, because I think both sides of the Polish political spectrum, the major sides, are committed to strengthening Poland, strengthening its security and its role in Europe. And I think Poland is now becoming America's anchor, if you like, in Europe, and it's becoming the military leader in Europe, particularly on the conventional side. So, and then that book is actually being printed as I speak, the English version, and there'll be a Ukrainian and Polish versions coming out sooner or later.
And we have a recommendation for the Montenegrin PEN or Faculty for Montenegrin Language and Literature. I want to actually mention that something that I missed in the beginning. Actually, the editors from Montenegrin PEN Center, who were actually in charge for producing this book on Montenegrin language. So the editors were Professor Adnan Čirgić, Professor Aleksandar Radoman, and Professor Boban Batricevic. Jelena Sušan was the editor and redactor of this, and the translator, I think Mr. Bugajski actually thanked her in the beginning, Jelena Pralas. Zahvaljujemo vam na izdvojenom vremenu za naše gosta i nadamo se, vidimo se nekom drugom lijepom prilikom. Hvala vam.